Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski. Today on the podcast, we're in South Carolina with kind of a historic figure. He's a humble guy too, but quite a life. You may know him from Instagram as Terry Coach Hamlin, author of the book about scientific running, how to build a better runner, founder of a very important running club, the Charleston Running Club, and co-founder of the Cooper River Bridge Run, which is coming up on its 50th anniversary. So I have a lot to talk about and get a glimpse into the history that parallels the history of running from the 1970s. Welcome today, Coach Terry. Hi.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it.
Let's start with your origin story as a runner. How and where and why did you get involved in running?
I like to say I accidentally got into running. I was a surfer. I had started surfing as a very young boy. And by the time I was about 14, I was a 3A ranked surfer. 4A is professional. And my girlfriend in high school went on to surf professionally. I surfed nearly every day, even in the winter. After school, when I was a senior, particularly, my classes ended by noon. I was in advanced classes, fortunately. Who knows how that happened? But we'd head for the surf. And to stay in shape for surfing, which if you surf for 5 or 6 hours, you better run too, because you need that endurance as well. So I ran. Starting at age 14, I would run 2, 3, 4, 5 miles a day. In addition to my surfing, I was building a runner package, but didn't realize it at that point. But when I chose a college, I got offers from 3 colleges. I chose USC. And then when I got there, I decided I didn't want to run on the team, which did not make my father very happy. But he did grudgingly say he would go ahead and pay my tuition anyway. By the time I got to the end of my sophomore year, I got discovered again by the cross-country coach at USC. I happened to be doing a tempo run on Green Street, which runs lengthwise in front of the Student Union building. And I was running pretty quickly. I was running maybe 5:10 a mile in the tempo run. I was in good shape. I was running maybe 60 miles a week. And this guy turns on to Green Street and he looks over at me and he's pacing me in his automobile and looking over at me. And I'm looking over at this guy and I'm going, what does this guy want? And who is he? And what in the world's going on here? And so I picked up
a beer can, yeah.
Yeah, I picked up the pace. I cranked it down. And he sped up and he's looking at his speedometer and looking at me. And finally he pulls away. So he goes up a few blocks and he stops the car and gets out and he flags me down. And he said, I'm sorry, I know that looked weird, but would you talk to me a second? I hate messing up your workout, but please talk to me. So I said, sure. He said, I'm the cross country coach here at USC. And what's your name? And I told him my name and he went, you're the guy that turned down the scholarship. And I said, yes, sir. And I told him why. I said, I'm just a loner guy when it comes to running. And he said, would you just give it a try on the team? And I said, okay. For a semester, I was a cross-country runner, a semester. And then I said, nah, I want to go back to the roads. And I became an independent runner and just on my own, cranked my mileage up over the years. And by the time it was 1977 or so, or 78, I was running anywhere from 70 to 125 miles per week, depending on the time of the year and what I was training for.
At the beginning, were you running on the beach?
At the very beginning, yes. Sometimes some of my miles were on the hard beach at low tide, where the sand is hard. But most of my running was on asphalt roads and just wherever I could find some space.
And then generally flat areas.
Oh, Charleston is flat as a pancake. We have one hill. And in fact, if you look at my Facebook picture for my Facebook post, that picture was taken by Runner's World magazine on the Silas Pierman Bridge, and it had a 20-inch wide sidewalk. And for whatever reason, they asked if they could do a little article on me. And I was not a big famous runner, but people knew me from the bridge run. I co-founded that race, and it was taking off very quickly. So in 1979, I was contacted and asked if they could take this picture. And I said, certainly. He said, can we do it on the bridge? And I said, yeah, sure. He said, I have a long telephoto lens. I'll be at the base of the bridge. If you'll just run up to the peak and just across the peak and come back and forth, we'll get the picture. It won't take long. 18.6 miles later, they got the picture.
Oh my
104 shots, and at about 5-minute mile pace. And when we got to about 15 miles, I stopped and I said, let me ask you a question. And he said, what's that? I said, are you a runner? And he said, no, sir. He said, I just take the photos for a magazine. And I said, I can tell. Do you understand what I'm doing up there? And he said, man, you're flying. I said, yeah, dude, I'm flying. But this was not the workout that I had planned today. I said, I'm running race pace, and here I am at 15 miles, and you still haven't gotten a suitable picture? And his reply to me was the funniest thing in the world when I think back on it now, but back then it was not funny. He said, well, I was waiting for the sunlight to get just right. And I said, let me ask you another question. And he said, what's that? I said, why didn't we start later? And his mouth kind of hung open, and he had no answer for that, of course. But we finally got the shot.
I ran the Jacksonville 15K race in the early 2000s. And to qualify for a good starting spot, I ran a bridge run down there somewhere in Jacksonville, just a 5K, just straight up, straight down, straight up, straight down. And yeah, I only had to do it once, but yeah, those are fun. Okay, there's a lot going on here. What about your accomplishments in your one semester or in high school that attracted attention? And did you have a coach in high school, or you've been self-coached all through this?
I've been self-coached. I'm a learning fanatic. If there's a subject or a topic that I'm interested in, I will just dive into it headlong, and I will learn everything I can about the subject. And I didn't need someone looking over my shoulder. And so I learned the hard way. I was fortunate enough through the bridge run be able to make contact with people like Benji Durden, who was on the 1980 team. In fact, Benji and I still talk almost every year. We invite him to the race, and he comes and shows up for our expo. Such a nice guy, real great guy. And of course, a 209 marathoner. And Dr. George Sheehan, who was the medical editor of Runner's World magazine, came a few times to the race, and he and I became friends. I'd call him on the telephone and ask him questions about this part of training and that thing and whatever. So I got to know a lot of people just by reaching out to them and speaking to them and asking for their assistance. And I got to know Bill Rodgers in a weird way. Bill got invited to a little small 10K race in Branchville, South Carolina, called the Railroad Days Festival. It had like maybe 125 runners. But the guy who put the race on was a physician from Atlanta and was friends with Jeff Galloway from the 72 Olympic team. Bill happened to be in Atlanta. Jeff said, hey, do you want to go and let's run this race as a favor to this guy? And so Bill said, yeah, why not? And I'm at the starting line. I look over and there's Jeff Galloway. And I look over here and there's Bill Rodgers on the front of the starting line. I go, uh-oh, what in the world is going on here? And how'd they even find Branchville, much less show up to race? But I ran a good race against him. I have to say, I was close. I didn't beat him, but I was close. And that impressed him. And so he and I started talking after that. And he, again, another really nice guy. And we became friends after that. And we just kind of stayed in touch and still do.
Yeah. People will notice he wrote the foreword to your book on scientific method.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. I sent the draft of the whole book to him. And I said, Bill, would you read this and tell me what you think? Should I have it published? And about 2 weeks later, he mailed it back to me. He said, if you don't have this published, you're an idiot. He said, this is actually good. And it actually makes practical sense for a huge swath of folks out there, from beginners to Olympians. And he said, and it also institutes what I always tried to convey to people, and that is to keep your running as play. Don't make your running work. Make your running play. And if it's play, you're more likely to do it. And he's right. And because I had a whole segment of one chapter on running as play. And yeah, good guy. Good guy.
Yeah.
I saw him last year at Boston. I had a couple of athletes running in Boston, and he and I hooked up for lunch and hashed over old times.
We'll talk about the bridge run, and to me, it's a great thing to talk about the development of running over the 50 years, all the milestones of, it wasn't in the 70s, but eventually money came in, wheelchair athletes, timing devices. The evolution of that can be traced looking through the evolution of the bridge run, add security, cooperation, and challenges with the government and organization of a giant run. We'll talk about that stuff, but I want to just go back a little bit to your origins there as you went to school, tried cross country, went back out. Were you still surfing?
No, I was 110 miles from the beach. I say no, but yeah, I surfed when I went home. If I would go home for a weekend, I'd grab my board and go out and hit the waves. And I was able to maintain. Surfing is one of those things, once you learn it, it's like riding a bicycle. You don't unlearn it. You're not quite as good and quick on your turns and things like that. But I still loved it. I loved being in the water and ripping those waves.
Yeah, somebody I interviewed on here from the west coast of the U.S. back then, Vince Engel, was a big surfer, and he's still surfing in Barcelona in the 70s. But yeah, it's there's a few surfers that have turned into runners, but it's not something that all runners get the connection to. That's cool. Before we talk about the founding of the Charleston Running Club, which I'd like to go to next, is the origin of you writing that book. How long did it take for that stuff to get into your mind? As you said, you embrace learning things. You're a Lydiard 2 coach. What was the process, kind of synopsis of going to, I'm going to write a book, and out it comes?
Yeah. I started actually coaching runners even when I was competing. When I created the running club and we grew so quickly, we decided to have a men's and women's competitive team. I was drafted to coach the women's team, and I was on the men's team. I would do my workout, and then I would do their workout with them. I enjoyed that because I made it clear to them. I said, I will never give you a workout that I'm not willing to do right alongside you. And that helped them to feel like this guy really cares about what he's doing here. And that team stayed undefeated in every single race for 3 solid years that I coached them, that women's team. And 2 of them made the Olympic trials. One, Ann Reed, broke the 3-hour barrier in South Carolina. She was the very first female to break 3 hours in South Carolina. And I was coaching her at the time. And that made headlines. And I started getting people asking me if I would help them. And so here and there, I would just help them. And then as time went by and my own competitive running was beginning to fade off into the sunset, I still wanted to be really involved in the sport. So coaching and learning and developing ways to make better runners became more of a focus for me. And my athletes kept saying, Coach, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. And for 10 years, I heard that all the time, just constant. And I said, I don't want to write a book. I don't even know how to write a book, and kept putting it off. Finally, several years ago, I said, it's time. Who knows? I may croak tomorrow, so I better get to work on this book if I'm going to ever write one. So I sat down and started writing just off the cuff. The first thing I did was I came up with 4 or 5 potential titles. And I said, I'll make the potential titles lead me to what the book is about. And Building a Better Runner was the one I finally chose. And so I said, how do you build a runner? And I was thinking this in my head. And I had been following Arthur Lydiard for decades. And I had tried everybody's training methods at one time or another. But Lydiard's method always stood out to me because it was so effective. And if done properly, without trying to add in unnecessary runs or runs that are too fast or runs that are not the right run in the right phase of the Lydiard system, you can become more than you ever expected as a distance runner. I've taken housewives who were not runners all the way to championships. And I took one guy who had never, he said, the only time I ever ran, I ran in the Army because I had to for PT. And so he came to me when he was in his late 30s, and he said, I want to run a marathon. And so I coached him for about 6 months, and he broke 3 hours first time. He ran 2:52. And I said, dude, you've missed your calling, man. I said, we need to get to work. I said, you've got a lot more in there than you realize. But the pleasure I get from it is immeasurable. To see them be so happy and smile and enjoy their sport and achieve something that they didn't realize they had in them. That's what makes me tick.
That's great. How did you get on to Lydiard? When did that come in? Your study of everything and running was your life? So
I started reading all of the books, all the training books, Jack Daniels books, stuff like that, Jeff Galloway's book. And then I happened upon Lydiard's information. And I said, this is what I've essentially been doing all these years, but he's telling me how to refine it in this book. And I started training that way. And immediately I said, yeah, this works. And I think that this will work for more people than the other systems. I'm not bashing the other systems at all. There are a lot of really good systems out there, but the Lydiard system just plain makes sense because it doesn't burn the runner out. It has different sections that you train in, and you train to a peak. And then after you've run your goal races, you take a recovery period. And it's a hard, easy system like most of them are, but it also focuses on building endurance and then adding in tempo runs and then adding in resistance runs. In other words, hill training, because he was big on hills.
I wanted to get to that. Where'd you find your hills?
We had that 20-inch wide sidewalk on the Cooper River Bridge. It's amazing that I'm still alive because we had 18-wheeler trucks coming by that were like 12 inches from you. So you had to make sure you maintained your balance. So I used that. And I also used sand dunes, which is what Lydiard did a lot of. He did a lot of sand dune running because that resistance from sand dunes is pretty incredible if you've got soft dunes and because you dig way down in them and you've got to really pump hard to run good in a sand dune. I lived on Sullivan's Island back during that period of time. And on Sullivan's Island, we had dunes all the way from my house to what's called Breach Inlet, and that's 3 miles. So 3 miles of dunes, and I would run them back and forth a couple of times for my resistance workout.
Yeah, people familiar with the sport, of course, know Lydiard's success with athletes in the Olympics, bringing almost unknowns from that time of the world to peak and win giant races, Olympics and things. And Percy Cerruti pictures on the dunes are known to everybody. This is just great. The whole history of running comes out through you. The last thing on the book, how long did it take to finish? And what about getting a publisher? How's that process?
I thought the book wouldn't be as challenging as it turned out to be. I started writing and it made sense to me, but a lot of it was too technological and had too much biochemistry in it. My wife was a summa cum laude English major in college. So I gave the first couple of chapters to my wife, who's not a runner, by the way. And I said, honey, would you read this and tell me what you think? It had all these chemical equations in it, and lactic acid, and here's mitochondria, and blah, blah, blah. And about 3 hours later, she walks back in to my office and she said, I only have one question. And I said, what's that? She said, what is this? She said, nobody will read this. Nobody can understand this except you and a chemist. She said, this is not readable. She said, it was the most boring thing I've ever read in my life. And I said, ouch, that hurt. And it was back to the grindstone. And so I wrote it again, and she said, nope, still not there. So I wrote the book 3 times, and it was much longer than the finished product. And the reason for that is I started looking at publishers, and I really wanted to get a local publisher, somebody I could go face to face with when needed. I actually found 3, and I talked to all 3 of them, and the one I most connected with, we made a deal to publish the book. And so I took him the draft, and he said, this is much too long. And I said, what? He said, I'm going to tell you something that's going to really disappoint you. He said, and it's not about you, it's about the American public. He said, do you know what the prime length of a readable book in America is today, since we have all this smart technology and people don't like to read? He said, 200 pages. And I said, 200 pages? I'm just getting going. I'm just getting wound up at 200 pages. He said, I know, I read it. He said, it'd be like a 350, 400 page book. And he said, you got to cut this thing down. So back I went. And finally, the finished product is 199 pages. Not including my email at the end. And he said, you're putting your personal email in there for people to contact you? And I said, yeah. I said, this is a book to help people. And if I'm afraid for somebody to reach out to me, I have no business writing it. I said, I'm not afraid of someone asking me a question, or even if somebody didn't like the book, I can handle it. I'm a big boy. And it actually has been pleasant. I've gotten lots of nice emails, and I've actually gotten athletes because of the book all over the country.
Yeah, it is distinctive. There are a few authors of kind of the famous older books of running, and some of them have been a little bit hard to track down. Not everybody's that bold to put that in. And that reminds me, Stephen Hawking, when he wrote his first book, they told him every equation you put in is going to cut your readership in half. So I can imagine. But you have a personal background in science, working in electrophoresis in a laboratory. So this stuff is just, what is this to a lot of people probably is not a lot normal to you. That's fantastic. Let's talk about the start of the Charleston Running Club. You're running with a buddy, and how did that come about?
Yeah, I had a guy I ran with every day for years. I would do 2 workouts usually a day. I would do an early morning workout, then shower and go into the medical university where I was employed. And then after work, he and I would meet up again for second workout of the day, the longer workout. We were running, I think it was a Tuesday night, and we were doing a tempo run. Bob, I said, I'm thinking about trying to start a running club. What do you think about that? I said, I see runners now running all around the city, and I think it'd be a cool thing to have a club for running. And he said, you'll have to do it yourself, because I tried to start a soccer club and I couldn't get anybody interested. And I said, that's because we're here in Charleston. Back then, soccer was pretty unknown. I said, but running, people saw other people running. And Kenneth Cooper had his book, Aerobics, and that was a big boon to running. So people were familiar and people were starting to stay in shape and get in shape. I went around the medical university complex and put up note cards inviting people to the first meeting of the Charleston Running Club at the Charleston County Library next day. 11 people showed up, and I was the 12th. So we had an even dozen to get started. Let's see, that was in February. And then by October, we had 464 members. And so it showed that there really was a desire for a running club. And we were already putting on races.
The timing of that is incredible. You just hit it when it seems like it was ready to explode. What happened at that first meeting, and how did you make a vision for the club?
I wanted input from everyone who was there, what their concept of a running club would be and what my concept would be. And I said, I would like a club that invites people, no matter their skill level, to come and run with us. And if you're slow, or if you're fast, or if you want to race or not race, or if you just want to socialize and go for a run and have a beer, come and join the running club. And we're going to eventually start putting on some races, hopefully. And people took to it.
Going from 12 to 400, how did you manage communications, meetings, and things? It must have been crazy, 6, 7, 8 months.
Oh, yeah, my iPhone in 1970s, yeah. My iPhone was me getting on the telephone and calling people. We had one guy who was a member of the club said he would do a newsletter. And every month we had a rudimentary newsletter, and we would hand mail it to all the members of the club and encourage them to get in touch with somebody that they may know who might want to become a member. And it grew exponentially in that manner.
What about finances? It's not free, even with the 7-cent or 12-cent stamps, whatever they were back then, apart from volunteer time. How did you figure that a budget, and when did that come into play with the club?
The budget was Terry Hamlin. Yeah, I almost became destitute because I would buy the stamps, I'd buy the paper. Now, my friend Walt, who did the newsletter, he would actually type it, but I wrote some of the articles. I would write an article, and we just made it happen. I think it was, like you said before, Matthew, it hit at the right time in history. And then when Bill broke the American record in 79 at Boston, people really took notice of this guy, and Runner's World magazine was starting to flourish. I was subscribing to Runner's World when it was a newspaper print, just a booklet, a little tiny little booklet. And of course, it went into a high gloss fancy thing for years. And
grab one of those lifetime subscriptions back then for about $50 or whatever they had.
It was less than that. Yeah. It was almost nothing. I don't know how they made any money. But I also met George Hirsch, editor. I met him at 10 Mile Race. I didn't know what he looked like, but he came up to me. Bob and I put on a 10 miler for Kiowa Island, and I was warming up, and George came up to me and introduced himself, and that's how they took the picture of me, because he apparently thought I was some sort of interesting guy. And I said, I don't know. I guess I'm interesting. I don't know if I'm interesting or just odd. But he was a nice fellow.
We'll go on to the Cooper River Bridge runs, but also that island run. You have a marathon there, and that's also a long-lasting run, the races that happen there. But let's talk about the origin story. A very simple story of the running club. You just having an idea and being told you got to do it yourself, so you just did it. But it came over these decades, a significant thing of hitting the time when the need was there, enabling obviously so many people to find a way to find races, to find the community, to become runners in their mind, even if they were joggers, even if they were casual. It changes the identity of people when you become part of a tribe and a club. And that certainly affected lives and the sport and the culture.
Yeah, if there wasn't a race, we would have a Saturday morning run, group run. The group run was out at a place called Charleston Landing, which is a state park, which is the original settlement of Charleston from 1670. They would allow us to come in and run for a couple of hours at no charge early in the morning on Saturday before they got, really cranked up and going. And it's a beautiful place to run. So we would meet there, and that group run started to grow and grow. And then we started finding other places we wanted to meet. And I think that was part of the attraction as well.
Who were some of the people that stepped up along the way after it was Coach Terry funding and organizing this? When did you get help running the club, and when did it demand that kind of extra manpower?
Yeah, people were very generous in offering their help after they realized that the club was getting too big for one guy to try to handle. And I had a life, at least I was trying to have a life. And a lot of friends who were in the club stepped up and said, I'll do the newsletter, I'll help set up the races. And our races, we were fortunate in the club to have a guy named Dr. Brian Smith, who was a nephrologist who had immigrated from South Africa to America, and he worked at the VA hospital. He was literally a mathematical genius. And I'm not kidding, he actually was on paper. So he would measure our courses for us. So our courses were down to the inch. He would measure them and remeasure them and calculate this and calculate that. And I couldn't even understand his math. It was like I could have been reading Chinese for all I knew. But Brian would measure our courses. Our very first marathon, as a matter of fact, Dr. Brian Smith set this marathon up on Isle of Palms as a 4-loop course. And it was down to the inch. It was completely accurate, but it went through Wild Dunes, the private Wild Dunes resort. And eventually Wild Dunes decided that we were an imposition. So they said, you can't hold the race through Wild Dunes any longer. At that time, we were talking about Kiowa. Kiowa reached out and said, we'll take it. And so we moved immediately over to Kiowa and took all that revenue with us, because at that point we were getting into 1,000 or 2,000 runners situation, and they were staying out at the resort and making money for Kiowa. Apparently Wild Dunes couldn't figure that concept, and they asked us to come back, and we said, sorry, you kicked us out once, who's to say you won't kick us out again? And so it is over there and has been for decades.
That's not the first time somebody tried to stop you from having a race. So
yeah,
that doesn't always work out so well. But let's get quickly to the origin of the Cooper Bridge Run and talk about the big challenge there and how you knocked that down too.
Yeah, I was in my lab, and Dr. Marcus Newberry, the Dean of Medicine at MUSC, was a member of our club, and he came into my lab, and I was the president of the club, and he said, I have an idea I want to talk to you about. I said, okay. The medical university was really trying to promote community health as well. And so he said, as part of our community health initiative, having a race from Mount Pleasant across the Cooper River Bridge to downtown Charleston, a 10,000 meter race. He said, do you think that's possible? And my exact words to him were, we can do that. That was in October of 77. Our first race was in April of 78. And we did run into some snags. And the biggest snag was we had one big tactical error after another. And that's called the learning process of putting on races. We decided to have the race on a Sunday because we thought there'd be less traffic and we would be less of an imposition on the community. But what we did not consider was the fact that we would be running through what's called the Four Corners of Law in Charleston, which is a historic block that has churches on it. And church was letting out as we were running by, and people couldn't get to their cars, they couldn't travel. And so that didn't go over so well. So we immediately had to shift it to Saturday. But before all of that, it was Wednesday before the Sunday race. I was in my lab working away, and I had two phones. One was the normal phone for test results on isoenzymes and isolated separate proteins. And the red line was for emergency results for a patient that may be dying. When the red phone rang, you better pick it up before the second ring. So the red phone rang, boom, I grabbed it. I said, Hamlin. The gentleman on the other end of the line said, is this Terry Hamlin? And I said, yes, sir, it is. How may I help you? And he said, Mr. Hamlin, my name is Silas Pierman, the guy who the bridge was named for, and who was the director of the South Carolina Department of Transportation in Columbia. And he said, Mr. Hamlin, I understand you're going to have a race from Mount Pleasant to Charleston across the Cooper River Bridge run this Sunday. And I said, yes, sir, we are. And a naive little me thought he was calling to congratulate us about this. However, he was not. He said, Mr. Hamlin, you can have a race anywhere in Charleston you want, but you're not shutting down the Cooper River Bridge, any lane or any portion thereof, to have a race across it. He said, it's my decision, and I'm the one who makes the decision, and it's my final decision, and I'm sorry. Now, this is 4 days before the race, and so I felt my stomach turn over, and I said, Mr. Pierman, I appreciate you calling. I said, I need to call the board members, because we had set up 6 or 7 guys as a board to put this thing on. I need to call my board members and let them know. And could I call you back in an hour after I talk to them? And he said, you can call me back, but it won't do any good. What he did not know is that we were smart enough to have on our board a state legislator who was also a runner, Dewey Wise, Senator Dewey Wise. So we called Dewey, and he was in session at the legislature that afternoon. And the secretary said, he'll call you back in 10 minutes. He called us back. We told him what happened. He said, I can fix this. He said, I have a bill going through the legislature that the governor has already agreed to sign. And I will tag onto the end of that bill, which had nothing to do with running, by the way, the use of the Cooper River Bridge 1 day per year ad infinitum by the Medical University in South Carolina and the Charleston Running Club. And he said, and it'll become law today, and Silas Pierman will have to be out of the picture. It passed, and we got to have the race, and Silas Pierman, I wasn't his favorite person for years.
And that changed for him. That it's such an institution, world, and certainly in the state.
Did you know that race is the 3rd largest 10K in America? the third largest in America and the fifth largest in the world.
Yeah. At one point, the cap was 40,000.
Yeah, we have it capped at 40. We let it one year get to 45,000. And if we had the space, we could easily have 75,000 people, because we have to turn people away every single year because we simply don't have the space for them to finish, because we finish in a little 1-block park downtown. And when you put 40,000 runners, their friends and family, and the vendors and the bands, we have rock bands playing, we have a big stage for the awards, et cetera, refreshments. I mean, it's shoulder to shoulder, literally.
Just like the running club, starting with 12 people, going to 400 and growing and lasting for decades. This race didn't start with 40,000 people, but it parallels the milestones. I can run them off. Maybe you probably can do a better job. At some point in the 80s came money, electronic timing, bib timing, celebrity participants from Oprah to across Hollywood, politics, international runners, the arrival of the Kenyans to the running world. All this is told in Cooper River Bridge Run history. What was it like at the beginning organizing that race? What was your day like for people who haven't organized and put on races? What was your day like at the beginning for race day?
First of all, Benji Durden ran our first race and won it. Benji stayed at my house at Isle of Palms. We had plenty of room, so Benji stayed with me. The girl who won was a girl named Lisa Lorraine, also from Atlanta. Lisa stayed with this young lady that I knew. She stayed at her house, and Benji stayed at our house. The morning of the race, I was up about 3:30. We started at Patriots Point, where the aircraft carrier is at that time. Met the guys that were helping, a couple of guys on the board, Dr. Keith Hamilton, Dr. Roy Hills, and several others. They had recruited a number of cyclists to lead the race. And we had just put out the word that we needed volunteers for traffic control and course monitors and mile markers and things like that. And one of the interesting things is that a lot of people don't know this, but back then, the AAU had a rule that if you had a road race that was 10,000 meters or less, you could not have water on the course. And we were at a board meeting and this came up. So the board members, 4 or 5 of the board members were physicians. And I said, listen, I'm going to tell you something. I'm a runner. You're a physician. I said, if we don't have water on that course and at the end, we could kill somebody. It's projected to be over 80 degrees at race time. I said, these are not well established runners. These are people who have just gotten up on a Sunday morning and decided they're going to go for a 10,000 meter race with no training. I said, somebody's going to have a heat stroke. We may lose some people. And they said, we're going to follow the AAU rules. I said, you're going to follow the AAU rules. I said, I'm not following them. There's going to be water on the course, and that's the end of it. So I went and rented long banquet tables. I bought 2,000 paper cups, got large coolers, and got a bunch of Citadel cadets to man the water stations. And so they say there was no water on the course that first year. That's not true. That's entirely untrue. I know because I put it there. And so we did have water on the course. I also put water, of course, at the end of the race. But despite that, we sent 38 people to the hospital that day in ambulances with heat-related problems. One of them being one of the guys who voted against having water on the course. And I never let him forget it, ever, ever, ever. And every time I see him, I bring it up again. And he's like, will this ever end? And I say, yes, when the good Lord takes you home, it will end. But until then, you will hear it from me. because we could have lost some people that day. It's a serious thing. When it was 82 degrees at start, and it was 84, 85 at the finish. And that's hard on people. With our humidity here, gosh, in April, it can be 60, it can be 90. And it looked like The Walking Dead for the last runners that came across the line. And it was pretty scary. We got lucky. Just sending those people to the hospital, we got lucky.
Yeah, lucky, but your background as a runner and knowing that and just saying, oh, I don't care what the rules are, we have to put the runners first. A cynical person or me might say, I bet those AAU rule makers never ran an 80-degree heat at 10,000 meters before this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's part one with Terry, Coach Hamlin. We had lots more to talk about, so we'll be back in the next episode with part two. Hey, I hope you enjoyed another episode. Do you have someone you'd like to hear interviewed on the podcast? You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel or on the website, running70s.com. That's running70s.com. Let me know what you think of the episodes and anyone, including yourself, you'd like to hear interviewed. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.